Inequality feels absolutely inevitable. If you look at the world and think, well, this is just human nature, someone has to be on top, we have to ask, is it an organic, inevitable result of human interaction, or is there a specific, brutal, and epic story behind it?
That's the question, isn't it?
And today, we are not diving into abstract economics. We're talking about genetics, technological innovation, widespread disease, and the absolute replacement of entire male bloodlines millennia ago.
That is the core of our deep dive today. We've pulled together some incredibly rich source material that forces us to reconcile archaeology, the startling clarity of modern genetics, and, current political and social issues.
The mission, then, sounds pretty ambitious.
It is. We're going to show how thousands of years of conquest still dictate social structures today.
So we are tracing this thread from, say, the rigid castes of India all the way through the extreme concentration of wealth in specific modern European capitals like Madrid, and ultimately to how the underlying bias of these ancient hierarchies is currently being coded into artificial intelligence algorithms. That is a monumental journey.
It is, but the data supports it. This deep dive is about understanding the origin story of rigid hierarchies. Specifically, how a major Bronze Age migration established a social project that was so effective, it was replicated globally.
And it left a genetic echo.
A genetic echo that proves the nature of the conquest itself. It's not a suggestion. The proof is measurable in our DNA.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the archaeologists who, frankly, saw the storm coming centuries before the geneticists could confirm it, working only with clay fragments and burial mounds.
We have to start with Marie Gimbutas.
Let's talk about her.
Gimbutas was a fascinating and foundational figure, a Lithuanian archaeologist working in the mid-20th century. Her experience of living through the upheaval of Eastern Europe, the constant invasions and cultural shifts, it undoubtedly shaped her view of history. So, based on the material record, the artifacts, the grave goods, the styles of pottery she observed across Europe, she posited two major interconnected theories.
And the first one, the one that proved astonishingly prescient, that's the Kurgan hypothesis.
Precisely. The Kurgan hypothesis asserted that a massive, violent invasion occurred from the Eurasian steppes, specifically the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which is modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia.
She identified this from burial.
Yes, from distinct burial practices, the Kurgan, or mound and warrior-focused artifacts. She concluded that this nomadic culture had replaced the earlier European cultures around the beginning of the Bronze Age.
And decades later,
ancient DNA sequencing confirmed her theory almost entirely. The Yamnaya migration wasn't a trickle, it was a demographic tsunami that fundamentally changed the genetic and linguistic landscape of Europe.
But then we have her second theory, which is maybe a bit more romanticized and definitely more debated. The concept of Old Europe.
Old Europe was her description of the Neolithic-era societies that came before the Kurgan invaders. She painted them as matrifocal, focused on the female principle, possibly even operating a decentralized matriarchy.
And peaceful.
Peaceful, and notably egalitarian. They built large, settled, unfortified cities, and in her interpretation stood in stark contrast to the patriarchal, military-focused invaders that followed.
But the data for this perfectly peaceful, egalitarian Neolithic utopia is, according to our sources, highly scrutinized and ultimately inconclusive. And that's a critical distinction.
It absolutely is. While the Yamnaya conquest is a confirmed genetic fact, the vision of a perfectly peaceful Neolithic Europe is often overstated.
So it wasn't a utopia.
Not at all. Archaeology clearly shows that the Neolithic era was not devoid of brutality. We have evidence, sometimes in the form of mass graves and fortified settlements dating from before the Yamnaya arrival.
So warfare was already happening.
It suggests warfare and brutal murders were already a part of the European experience. And furthermore, while we see evidence of goddess worship in female figurines, there is no solid, consensus-based evidence for a widespread systemic matriarchy across the entire continent.
The reality was more complex.
Far more complex than a simple pre-conquest utopia.
And this complexity is precisely where history and science get horribly twisted, often by the very ultranationalist groups who claim to worship ancestral purity and strength.
That is the insidious maneuver. Ultranationalists and racists today cherry-pick Gimbutas's work to fit their contemporary narratives of dominance. They accepted the Yamnaya invasion. In fact, they embrace it with fervor.
Because it glorifies the conquering warrior.
Exactly. It validates a history of domination and confirms their desired narrative of European identity being founded on patriarchal military power. But they absolutely despise the theory of an egalitarian old Europe.
Because it directly undermines their core hierarchical belief systems.
It's a direct threat to it. So they adhere to this toxic mix of social Darwinism and a kind of brutal Nietzschean nihilism, viewing violence and dominance not as unfortunate history, but as inevitable, desirable, natural selection.
And they condemn any suggestion of pacifism or communal living as weakness.
As degeneracy, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's the intellectual framework of conquest applied to modern life. They co-opt the historical genetic narrative to justify current hierarchical structures and social cruelty.
But the distortion doesn't end there. Our sources say to complicate things even further, you sometimes see these fascist or neo-nihilist groups appearing to support a kind of, a sui generis matriarchate.
Or at least an elevated status for women.
Which usually takes the form of romanticized legends, maybe specific Celtic druidesses or mythological tribal witches. How is that fundamentally deceptive?
The deception lies in the mechanism of power. This is not genuine structural gender equality. The insight here is crucial. These groups only treat very specific women from their supremacist elites who share their ideology and class as equals.
Ah, so it's conditional.
Very. They may allow these specific women to govern or occupy powerful roles, but they continue to consider the vast majority of women, especially those of lower class or other races, as inherently inferior or useful only for reproduction.
So it's high-class co-option.
Exactly. It's designed to maintain hierarchy while projecting a facade of strength or diversity at the apex.
The sources draw a chilling modern parallel here to the Opus Dei ultra-Catholic sect in Spain, which seems counterintuitive given their traditional structure.
It is counterintuitive, but it highlights the enduring strategic nature of classist power games. The Opus Dei is defined as a highly classist, strictly machista organization, yet they strategically recruit and co-opt high-class, well-connected women.
And why? What's the goal?
These women are then placed in powerful political, economic, and media posts. It allows the sect to penetrate, influence, and control institutions far more effectively than if they only relied on their male members.
So they gain access to networks and power structures through these elite women.
Precisely. It is a calculated move to advance the sect's agenda. Meanwhile, the general female members, particularly those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, are overwhelmingly relegated to duties of domestic servitude and cleaning within the organization's centers.
So the structural inequality remains.
The core Yamnaya-style hierarchy remains, but the power elite strategically uses select, privileged women to advance its agenda. It's classism weaponized for political gain.
It's a subtle but powerful form of manipulation. Before we move into the conquest itself, let's lay out the three definitive, proven genetic layers of Europe for you, the listener.
Okay, so these are the three major population shifts that define modern European genetics. First, the Paleolithic layer, the original hunter-gatherers who survived the last ice age. Genetically, they were characterized by having black or very dark skin.
Then came the farmers.
Second, the Neolithic layer. These were the farmers migrating out of Anatolia roughly 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. They introduced agriculture, sedentary life, early cities, and importantly, they introduced lighter skin genes into the population.
And the third layer, the one that defines the hierarchy we're discussing today.
The definitive shift. The Bronze Age layer. This was the massive invasion from the steppes of Ukraine and Russia, the Yamnaya culture, around 4,500 to 5,000 years ago. This influx completely overwrote the male lineages established by the previous two layers.
Okay, let's pivot to that Bronze Age tsunami, the Yamnaya. The sheer scale of the genetic replacement they achieved, particularly of the male line, is, well, it's almost unparalleled in history. What overwhelming technological, logistical, and biological advantages allowed them to win so decisively?
It was indeed a perfect storm of advantages. You have to understand that the Neolithic cultures they encountered, the settled farmers, were largely localized. They hadn't evolved a sophisticated, long-range military tradition.
And the Yamnaya did.
The Yamnaya had three critical edges.
Start with the technology that defined them. The horse.
Horse domestication. The Yamnaya were the first people in the world to successfully domesticate the horse for transport and military use on a massive scale. This gave them a staggering military superiority.
I can't even imagine.
Imagine the sheer shock factor. A fast-moving cavalry unit descending on a static agricultural village. It wasn't just speed, it was psychological terror. It allowed them to perform rapid, large-scale raids and long-distance movements that sedentary farmers simply could not counter.
And that's why all modern horses.
This is why every single domestic horse today traces its ancestry back to the Yamnaya stock.
An ancient version of overwhelming shock and awe.
Absolutely. Secondly, logistics. They introduced the four-wheel carriage for transport. This may sound mundane, but it dramatically improved their ability to sustain large movements of people, supplies, and loot across vast, often difficult distances.
A capability the settled cultures just didn't have.
Far beyond them. Later, groups moving east toward Anatolia and India would develop the light war chariot with spoked wheels, accelerating their conquest across Asia, but the mobility foundation was set by the horse and the wheeled carriage.
So, superior mobility and logistics. Now let's discuss the biological factors, which are perhaps the most surprising and decisive.
This is where the story gets really interesting. They carried the gene for lactose tolerance.
Which meant they could drink milk.
Raw milk, well into adulthood. For a nomadic group, this is a massive military advantage. A reliable, portable, protein-rich food source that required no farming, no stopping, and no lengthy preparation.
It just kept them going.
It allowed them to sustain caloric intake during long, arduous campaigns, giving them a relentless edge over settled, grain-dependent populations.
But the plague connection is truly unsettling. They brought the plague, but they survived it.
Yes. Genetic analysis shows that the Yamnaya were carriers of the bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, and were instrumental in introducing it to Europe for the first time. The crucial factor is that through generational exposure on the steppes, they had developed a degree of genetic resistance.
And the Neolithic farmers hadn't.
For the settled, dense, and immunologically naive Neolithic farmers, this encounter was catastrophic.
It's a terrifying combination.
The combination of superior mobility, constant reliable calories, and biological resilience to the very disease they introduced created conditions for near-total dominance.
And this cultural dominance left a massive linguistic echo, defining the languages spoken by billions today.
The Yamnaya invasion is the origin of virtually all modern Indo-European languages. This linguistic conquest demonstrates the depth of their cultural and social overwrite.
Just think of the sheer variety.
From Sanskrit in India to English in the West, all descended from this single steppe source. The only major exceptions remaining in Europe are Basque, which stands as the sole pre-Indo-European language remaining.
And a couple others.
And the later Uralic languages, like Finnish and Hungarian, which arrived from a different Eastern source much later.
When we talk about the sheer magnitude of the conquest, the data from the Iberian Peninsula is cited as the most stark proof of this genetic tsunami. What does the 100% substitution of masculine lineages actually tell us about the nature of the conquest?
It tells us that the conquest was overwhelmingly violent and systematic. In the Iberian Peninsula, the substitution of the previous local masculine lineages, the Paleolithic and Neolithic Y chromosomes, was almost 100%.
That's an astonishing figure.
It is. Even in massive, well-documented historical migrations and conquests, you rarely see more than 20 to 30% replacement of the Y chromosome.
So why is 100% so shocking?
It suggests an absolute social and genetic overwrite. It's evidence of systematic mass violence against the men of the preceding cultures. The invading Yamnaya men established absolute dominance, reproducing with the local women, but replacing the entirety of the existing paternal genetic structure.
So it wasn't intermingling.
We are talking about total social control enforced through brutality. It was an imposition.
And even the Basques, who maintained their unique pre-Indo-European language and culture, were not immune to this masculine genetic overwrite.
Not at all. Despite their cultural and linguistic isolation, the data shows that the Basques still carry one of the highest percentages of Yamnaya masculine DNA in Europe. This just reinforces the sheer scale and effectiveness of the conquest across the entire peninsula.
So cultural distinctiveness was no shield.
No shield at all from the genetic restructuring in the male line.
Before we move on to the global blueprint, there's a dark historical footnote about the complexity, even within Yamnaya descent, addressing the haplogroup R1a.
Right, which is associated with groups moving eastward and contributing significantly to Slavic populations.
So this is a crucial note to understand how supremacist ideologies operate.
It is. Haplogroup R1a is undeniably of steppe, of Indo-European origin. Yet the Nazi regime, through their Blut and Boden plan, arbitrarily declared Slavs subhuman.
Despite sharing this deep ancestry.
Despite that, yes. They were slated for extermination or slavery, and their lands were intended to be stolen and cultivated by Germans.
So even shared ancestral genetics did not guarantee protection or inclusion. It just confirms that for supremacist systems, genetics is a tool, not a truth.
Exactly. Purity is never a consistent scientific target. It is a fluid ideological weapon used to justify arbitrary cruelty against whomever is deemed the enemy of the moment, regardless of common ancestry. The goal is power, not biology.
So the Yamnaya successfully invaded Europe and established a new social order. But the truly world-changing event, as our sources show, is that they exported a fully formed social project. How did these heirs of the steppes institutionalize their hierarchical organization and replicate it globally?
They codified their conquest into religious and social laws. The blueprint they established was fundamentally built on rigid hierarchy, defining people based on their relationship to the conquering lineage.
And it was effective.
So effective that future conquering powers, centuries later, would find this structure and replicate it, often without consciously referencing the Yamnaya, simply because it worked to maintain control.
Let's start with the most famous example of this. India and the Varna system.
The Indo-Aryans, who were the eastern branch of the Yamnaya diaspora, advanced into the Indian subcontinent. They encountered the indigenous Dravidian peoples and imposed a stratified, enduring hierarchy, the Hindu caste system.
And this system is known as Varna.
Yes, and the sources explicitly state what Varna means. Color.
Color. The literal meaning is the key.
It is. The Varna system was created to distinguish the light-skinned, noble color of the Aryan invaders, the highest castes, the Brahmins and Kshatriyas, from the dark-skinned enemy color of the native Dravidian peoples who were relegated to the lowest castes.
So the entire structure of society was built on this.
The social, religious, and economic structures were explicitly designed to maintain the dominance of the invading lineage, solidifying the inequality for thousands of years.
Now, jump centuries later to the colonial era. The Spanish, arriving in the Americas, replicated this schema almost precisely, but with even greater complexity.
They absolutely did. Recognizing the challenge of governing a new mixed-race colonial population, the Spanish established an incredibly complex system of 16 main castes and literally countless subcastes, all built on fractional levels of racial mixing.
It sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare.
It was the ultimate bureaucratic tool for classification and control, ensuring Spanish-born individuals, the peninsulars, remained at the absolute apex, holding all the economic and political power.
But the Spanish system had this perverse bureaucratic twist compared to the rigid, religiously sealed Indian Varna system. It allowed for blancamiento, or blanching.
Blancamiento offered a specific, limited form of social mobility, primarily for lighter-skinned mixed individuals. If you were of mixed heritage, you could theoretically achieve a higher social status or move up the caste ladder by strategically marrying into a lighter, higher caste over successive generations.
So it acknowledged mixing, but
it acknowledged mixing, but actively prioritized the whiter lineage. The societal goal was to reach the lighter European apex.
But this system was engineered to keep one group permanently oppressed, brutally denying them even the possibility of blancamiento.
That was the foundational cruelty toward the black population imported through the transatlantic slave trade. The system was explicitly designed to deny black people any true mobility or even a path to legitimate blanching.
So no matter what, they stayed at the bottom.
Regardless of the degree of intermixing, the system worked to keep them permanently at the base of the hierarchy, ensuring that the legacy of slavery and racial oppression remained structurally fixed. The hierarchy was designed to be permeable at the margins for non-black populations, but fundamentally sealed for black people.
So whether we look at the Indo-Aryans imposing the Varna system or the Spanish imposing the caste system, the template established by the Yamnaya, a rigid hierarchy based on the superiority of the conquering male lineage, was the global blueprint for social control.
It was a template of institutionalized dominance, establishing deep-seated inequality based on perceived racial or class superiority that has survived in political and economic systems worldwide.
If the conquest was indeed built on the pattern of invader men and local women, we should be able to read that story clearly in modern genetic profiles. How do we see this specific genetic echo across continents today, millennia later?
The pattern is visible in conquest zones globally, acting as a biological signature. When a conquering group establishes dominance, the conquering men carrying the Y chromosome, which is passed only through the male line,
Right.
they reproduce with the local women who carry the mitochondrial DNA or maternal lineage. The result is a population where the paternal genetics mirror the invaders and the maternal genetics mirror the local population.
Let's analyze this structure in Latin America.
In Latin America, the population today shows a high proportion of European Y chromosome DNA, the paternal lineage, which is the genetic echo of the male conquerors arriving from Spain and Portugal.
And the maternal line.
This is contrasted with a mitochondrial DNA profile that is majority indigenous and African, reflecting the maternal lineages of the original Native American and enslaved African populations. It's a perfect biological record of colonial dominance.
The United States provides an even darker, more specific example of this asymmetrical genetic pattern resulting from historical oppression, specifically slavery.
It serves as undeniable evidence of systematic violence. A significant portion of the current African-American population in the United States possesses European paternal lineages.
And there's only one way that could have happened on such a large scale.
The only historical context that explains this widespread genetic transfer is systematic sexual abuse and rape committed against enslaved African women during the slavery era. The DNA acts as a permanent, silent witness to that era of brutality and forced reproduction.
And for a geographically specific, really stunning example of this dynamic, the sources highlight the Canary Islands.
The Canary Islands showcase the conquest signature perfectly. When the Spanish conquered the islands in the 15th century, the indigenous population were the Guanches, a North African Berber group.
Okay.
Today, the masculine DNA across the islands is overwhelmingly Spanish and European, reflecting the conquest and subsequent settlement. However, on some specific islands, up to 60% of the maternal DNA still comes from the Guanches.
60%. That's incredible. It's a vivid, modern confirmation of the historical pattern. The invading men dominated, replacing the male bloodlines, but the maternal line, the deep indigenous heritage, persisted and endured.
It proves that the history we are discussing is not abstract. The mechanism of the Yamnaya conquest, the imposition of the dominant male lineage while incorporating local women, is written into our very cells, thousands of miles and thousands of years apart.
So if this hierarchical blueprint was established globally, what happens when it gets stuck or fossilized locally, especially in regions that were historically insulated from rapid modernization? That transitions us perfectly to the specific modern consequences we see in Spain.
Spain offers a unique and rather distressing case study because of its persistent stagnation. Unlike many of its European neighbors, Spain remained anchored in a state of quasi-feudalism until well into the 20th century.
What did that mean, practically?
It meant large estates were still controlled by a few aristocratic families or the church. There was very little industrialization, and the social mobility mechanisms that swept through Northern Europe were stunted.
And the data reflects this profound historical failure to develop and modernize.
Absolutely. This stagnation resulted in some of Europe's highest rates of illiteracy and staggering inequality, particularly concentrated in the large landowning regions of the South.
And the consequences are still visible today.
They are. This historical lack of development has directly contributed to the phenomenon of the España vaciada, or emptied Spain.
Rural depopulation on a massive scale. The sources point out that Spain's statistics for rural emptiness are only surpassed by the Arctic regions of Nordic countries. That's a massive social wound.
It illustrates that deep-seated systemic inequality is just as effective at emptying a country as harsh Arctic climates are. When the state and the elite fail to invest in development, education, and infrastructure outside of the capital, people leave.
And this creates huge disparity.
Massive internal migrations, gutting the rural heartlands and creating massive demographic and economic disparities.
We see this concentrated inequality highlighted in the specific economic comparison between the southern province of Almeria and the capital Madrid. This juxtaposition perfectly illustrates wealth extraction.
It shows the gap between where wealth is produced and where it is concentrated. Almeria leads Andalusia's regional GDP per capita, largely thanks to its massive greenhouse farming operation, the famous Mar de Plástico.
The Sea of Plastic.
Yes, this complex generates enormous wealth through agricultural exports, supplying much of Europe's winter produce.
Yet, despite this high regional output, Almeria remains one of Spain's poorest provinces in net income per capita.
Exactly. The official net income per capita sits around 11,500 euros. The immense wealth generated by that agricultural complex is overwhelmingly concentrated,
While the laborers and local communities remain impoverished.
household incomes in the cities surrounding the Sea of Plastic are officially reported as low as only 12,000 euros annually. This is a profound disconnect. Production happens in the periphery, but capital accumulation happens at the center.
And that center is Madrid, which acts as the national aspiradora, or vacuum.
Madrid sucks capital and resources from the entire country. It concentrates financial services, political administration, and the headquarters of major corporations. This centralizing effect results in Madrid enjoying vastly superior and continuously growing GDP and wealth compared to the peripheral or southern provinces.
So it's extreme internal inequality.
Driven by historical and structural centralization, a system that benefits the apex of the hierarchy and maintains the dominance of the capital elite.
For immigrants and the lower classes across Spain, this isn't just about economics, it's about navigating systemic hurdles. The sources detail 4 insurmountable barriers that actively maintain this historical class structure. Let's start with the most obvious: rampant corruption.
Corruption is estimated to cost tens of billions of euros annually. The actual data is impossible to obtain because the corruption is so pervasive in procurement, infrastructure projects, zoning, political kickbacks.
It's everywhere.
And this constant drain undermines public trust, starves essential services, and funds illicit power networks, ensuring that money flows to the connected few, not to the general public.
Second, there is a structural, non-political form of corruption guild corporatism. This is fascinating because it's a direct inheritance from medieval power structures.
It is a crucial, often overlooked mechanism of inequality. We are talking about mafias of professional guilds, university-titled professionals like doctors, lawyers, as well as highly regulated sectors like taxi drivers who fiercely protect their territory.
And they shield themselves from
What? From criticism, from outside competition, and from market-based regulation. This isn't just about modern lobbying.
How does it link back to the Yamnaya era hierarchy?
It is a direct continuation of medieval guild rules that were designed to prohibit entry to foreigners, non-Catholics, and previously Spanish Jewish converts. The custom persists today in preventing open competition and maintaining exclusivity,
So only the right people can get in.
ensuring that only people from the right background with the right familial connections can enter and prosper in certain protected professions. It's an inherited system of caste-based professional protection.
Third, the existence of a massive shadow economy, known as economía sumergida.
A vast portion of the Spanish economy operates in B or off the books. This includes corrupt companies and unlicensed contractors avoiding taxes, but the major factor is the massive amount of black money generated by criminal activity.
Specifically, drug trafficking.
Narcotics trafficking, especially cocaine trafficking, contributes significantly to this pool due to the enormous profits made by mafias of all nationalities operating within Spain.
So the shadow economy not only starves the state of tax revenue, but also funds the criminal power structures that enforce local inequality.
Exactly. It muddies the economic waters, destabilizes legitimate sectors, and provides vast, untraceable wealth used to corrupt politicians, police, and businesses, further cementing the status quo.
And the fourth barrier brings us full circle to the classism we discussed earlier. Caste classicism and elite sects, specifically the influence of Opus Dei.
This refers to the persistence of rigid classism, where merit is secondary to connections and shared ideology. Organizations like the Opus Dei are instrumental in this. They strategically target and co-opt elites to maintain overwhelming political, economic, and educational power.
Especially when the right wing governs.
Yes. The concentration of their influence is staggering. Published reports suggest this ultra-Catholic sect holds up to a third of Spanish judgeships, despite being a tiny fraction of the total population.
A third of the judiciary. That is an extreme concentration of power. How does that impact the overall system?
It creates a system based on institutional trust rather than impartiality. Control over the judiciary means control over constitutional interpretation, the resolution of property disputes, and critically, the handling of high-level corruption investigations.
So the elite can operate above the law.
It ensures that the established elite can often operate above the law, maintaining their position at the apex of the system, replicating the rigid hierarchical structure first established by the Yamnaya conquerors millennia ago.
So we have pervasive corruption, entrenched professional monopolies, a gigantic black market, and elite religious sects influencing the judiciary, all combining to create a system where social mobility is incredibly difficult.
And the ancient class structure is self-healing. The source material suggests that the rigid, persistent structures we see in Spain, the extreme classism, the anti-competitive corporatism, may be a case of fossilized Yamnaya customs surviving for millennia. It is a historical time capsule.
And you mentioned the parallel in India, suggesting this kind of institutional endurance is plausible.
It's not unprecedented for cultural blueprints to last. In India, the heritage of the steppe invaders survives not just in the foundational caste system, but in specific, often minute wedding rituals and religious texts that have been transmitted orally and remained essentially unaltered since the time of the invasions.
So if it can happen there.
If such fundamental customs can persist unchanged in India for thousands of years, it is highly plausible that the rigid hierarchical power structures established by the Yamnaya conquerors were maintained and fossilized within the unique, non-industrialized, quasi-feudal environment of Spain.
The hierarchy survived the ages.
It survived because the structures that enforce it resisted modernization.
So the DNA of inequality is not only genetic, but profoundly cultural and structural. Now let's make the final, terrifying leap into the 21st century and address how this ancient hierarchy is finding a new, supposedly neutral expression, the mathematical lie and the manipulation of AI.
This is the new front. We are seeing a growing trend, heavily promoted by online alt-right groups, of moving away from overt violence or explicit racial language toward a seemingly more tolerant facade.
And they're using the same rigorous statistical tools as geneticists, but weaponizing them for social media validation. Specifically, principal component analysis, or PCA.
PCA is a legitimate, powerful statistical tool. It analyzes complex data sets by reducing dimensionality. It identifies the principal axes of variation, the strongest statistical components within the data.
And in genetics, this shows relatedness.
Right. But supremacist groups take raw genetic data and manipulate the PCA results to validate their biases, presenting these manipulated graphs online as scientific proof.
How exactly do they manipulate a statistical process like PCA?
They mold the raw data to their preferences by intentionally minimizing or outright eliminating the weight of data that doesn't support their narrative. For example, if they are trying to prove European purity in a Spanish population sample, they know there's an inconvenient truth.
The presence of North African heritage.
Exactly, from historical contact and migration, which is inconvenient to their narrative of exclusive European descent.
So they just delete it.
They reduce the weight of or eliminate entirely that North African genetic component. By removing this critical dimension, the PCA algorithm is forced to compensate. It reassigns those genetic segments to the next nearest component, which, given the geography, is usually a northern or central European component.
Creating a false graphic of purity.
A false graphic that fits their narrative.
So we must distinguish absolutely clearly between legitimate, peer-reviewed academic science and these amateur tools. What are the specific amateur tools our sources warn against that facilitate this manipulation?
The primary amateur tool mentioned is G25 coordinates, often used with a software called Vahaduo. This is not an official academic standard used for peer-reviewed studies. Users of this tool intentionally engage in what is called overfitting models.
Can you break down overfitting for us in this context?
Think of it like a simplified model of reality. If you are trying to understand the full genetic complexity of a Spanish sample, you need comprehensive reference populations, Iberian, North African, Near Eastern, and so on.
But overfitting removes some of those.
Overfitting occurs when users intentionally remove essential reference populations like North Africans or specific Iberian components from their model. When these critical categories are absent, the algorithm is forced to reassign DNA segments to the nearest remaining reference populations,
which are often generalized European categories,
like Celtic or Germanic. So the algorithm doesn't find the truth. It finds the closest lie that fits the restricted data set.
That is precisely the danger.
It artificially inflates the appearance of European purity in the resultant graphics, providing visually compelling but scientifically dishonest results for online consumption.
Another warning sign is websites like Wikipedia maps.
Wikipedia is explicitly a commercial website that relies on self-reported data and simplified interpretation, not a scientific institution. Its maps often distort real genetic data by coloring large geographic areas to create the illusion of sharp, non-existent genetic borders.
Like a hard line between Celtic and Slavic ancestry.
Exactly. Genetic reality is a cline, a slow gradation of change across a continent. These maps simplify that complexity into politically useful, visually distinct blocks that reinforce segregationist ideas.
And the stunning irony is that these amateur groups who are practicing deliberate mathematical dishonesty fiercely attack serious objective scientists.
They project their own flaws. They accuse reputable scientists who publish in journals like Nature, Science, or Cell of following a leftist or woke agenda. They cannot tolerate valid, objective scientific results because it contradicts their preconceived notions of superiority and purity.
They've found a way to use math to lie.
And they try to silence anyone who uses math to reveal the truth.
This manipulation is moving far beyond online debates about ancestry. The expert warns that the social danger of validating malleable mathematics is terrifying because of its implications for artificial intelligence.
If we, as a society, accept the premise that mathematical outcomes are easily moldable to fit bias, and that this manipulation is then deemed objective science, we set a devastating precedent for fields that rely heavily on big data and artificial intelligence.
This is the ultimate danger to structural equality.
It is.
Because public administration and major institutions increasingly rely on this type of statistical analysis for critical decisions.
Exactly. Many sophisticated algorithms used by public administrations in housing, risk assessment, credit scoring, or predictive policing employ statistics, similar to PCA. If these systems are trained using historically biased data
that has been overfit or manipulated to hide inconvenient truths, like deep class divisions or concentrated poverty,
the resulting AI software will learn and solidify those prejudices.
So the ancient class structures, forged by Bronze Age conquest, are simply getting a modern, neutral-sounding cloak. The injustice is perpetuated under a mask of irrefutable digital neutrality.
The Yamnaya hierarchy, which dictated who was on top 4,000 years ago, is being translated into code that dictates who gets a loan, whose neighborhood gets monitored by police, or who gets targeted for social services today.
The output of the algorithm will simply reinforce historical inequality.
It reinforces ancient hierarchies with new, sophisticated, and seemingly objective digital walls. The modern algorithm is the ultimate fossilized Yamnaya custom.
Finally, let's address the cultural environment that allows this inequality and mathematical manipulation to flourish, especially in Spain. The sources mention a clear difference in how structural inequality is discussed compared to, say, the United States.
There is a notable difference in visibility. In the U.S., for example, social crises and deep-seated structural problems like the effects of the fentanyl epidemic are often highly visible in the media. In Spain, there is what the sources call a persistent media blackout regarding marginalized neighborhoods and structural inequalities.
Why the silence? Is it just apathy?
It is more complex and more actively enforced. Several factors contribute. Journalists often fear reprisals or libel suits if they expose powerful figures. Crucially, marginal neighborhoods where deep inequality and illicit economic activity thrive are often governed by local mafias who absolutely do not allow cameras to show the real situation.
So there's an active suppression of information.
An active suppression designed to maintain the idealized image of the country.
And this information suppression is ferociously defended by an organized digital army.
Absolutely. There is an organized army of trolls on social media that fiercely attacks any criticism of the status quo or any challenge to the idealized image of Spain promoted by high-class and fascist interests. This effort serves to harass, silence, and exhaust dissenters.
And this silence extends to powerful historical institutions, making certain topics virtually taboo and beyond public accountability.
Yes, the sources highlight major taboo topics, criticizing the crimes of fascism and the Franco era, exposing the widespread institutional pedophilia within the church, or questioning the immense power of the Opus Dei sect.
So critics face real consequences.
Anyone who dares to criticize the status quo, or worse, present concrete proofs of corruption, faces significant negative consequences, including threats of violence and coordinated digital and legal attacks. It is an extreme level of social manipulation designed to enforce a silence that protects ancient, entrenched power structures.
We started this deep dive by asking a fundamental question. Where does inequality truly come from? Is it simply human nature?
And we found the answer is far more specific and complex than simple nature. It is the result of a highly effective, millennia-spanning social blueprint.
A blueprint built on technological supremacy, the horse, the wheel, and biological advantage, total military conquest, and the systematic brutal replacement of entire male populations.
Setting a permanent, institutionalized hierarchy in place across the globe.
And the most chilling discovery is that this history isn't relegated to history books. It's actively being maintained and repurposed, not just by historical institutions like elite sects and guilds, but by the very mathematics and data systems we trust to guide our future.
Reinforcing these ancient hierarchies with new, sophisticated, objective-sounding digital walls.
The enduring power of this legacy is its ability to adapt and camouflage itself.
The Yamnaya conquered Europe with a bronze axe and a horse. Their heirs are now using big data and algorithms to achieve the same result, maintaining control and defining who belongs at the top of the social structure, disguised as impartial code.
So the next time you encounter an AI algorithm or a data visualization that seems to subtly favor one class or demographic over another, perhaps denying a loan or adjusting an insurance rate or deciding which neighborhood gets more police surveillance, ask yourself, is this truly objective code based on unbiased inputs? Or is this the sound of the Bronze Age Yamnaya horse echoing through the big data? Something for you to mull over.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.